Hello there, and welcome to TaAF Talks, the show that's all about influencing positive change and doing things differently. My name is Jamie Waugh, and I'm the Programme Manager and Creative Lead of TaAF. And alongside me, as always, my partner in crime, the magical, the memorable, often quite mumbly, Ken Massey.
Hello.
How you doing, Ken?
Yeah, another great introduction. Thanks very much.
You're welcome.
Very exciting day for us today. And we're going to be discussing some really interesting topics with Chief Executive of Sport England, Tim Hollingsworth. We can't believe that you're here with us, but we're going to make the most of it while you are.
I don't see why you would want to say that, Ken, but thank you. I'm absolutely delighted to be here. Thanks for having me. Hello, Jamie.
Hello.
So I think just very quickly what we're going to cover in today's podcast is kind of a chat around organisational and cultural change, both within Sport England and then within communities. And then in the second half, a bit about what could people be thinking about individually if they have an ambition to start to change the system and the culture in which they live, in effect.
And we'll share all of our own experiences and learning and then see where we get to.
Yeah.
Wicked. Okay, so Tim, if you've heard this podcast before, and I can only guess that you haven't, otherwise you wouldn't be sat there now.
I was warned. Yeah.
We're going to ask each guest what success for this podcast for them is personally. So, for you, what would that be?
Well, two things, actually, if I'm allowed two things. One is having spent the day with the TaAF programme and the local delivery pilot more generally, the sense of what's going on up here in Pennine, Lancashire. I'd quite like to make sure that we reflect on that a little bit because, what you are, when you talk about cultural change and change behaviour, what you're finding and learning and what we've heard today is absolutely rooted in that. And then secondly, I want to try and make it as interesting as you do to your listenership because I can talk forever about cultural change, but actually it's what can people take away from it that would be helpful. So if we can do those two things, that'll look like success. Oh, and I've got a train to catch.
So the third one, we probably should have led with that.
It's timing.
Okay.
No, I'm looking forward to it.
Brilliant. Okay, so we'll reflect on those at the end, and we'll gauge how well we did. So I think really, really quickly, I think it would be nice just to, for listeners who may not know, Tim, and give you a sense for who you are.
Yeah.
Really quickly, cover what's a typical week for you, and how do you unwind at the end of that typical week.
Okay, I don't think there is much of a typical week other than the fact that there are always three audiences for what I'm doing. Sport England is an organisation of 300 people, and obviously even before you get to the people that we work with, there is an awful lot to be done every week that is about the effective leadership and management of the organisation. Secondly, Sport England does not exist in a vacuum. We are part of an ecosystem, I think and hope, of organisations involved in sport and physical activity, some of those slightly more traditional, but actually even including, in terms of government and the way that we interact with them. Certainly the way in which people have, the organised sports sector and leisure operators and governing bodies and all those. And then lastly and thirdly, there is the part of the job which is understanding who our unusual suspects are. So if if we're looking to really create change, and that's what we're here to talk about, we can work with and through some very, very long-standing established partners. We've got a high degree of understanding and trust, but I think there's also a recognition that they're not necessarily the best geared organisations to reach parts of the community that previously haven't felt that was for them. And so an increasing part of my week is about that balance between understanding how I run an organisation or help run an organisation, how I work with our sort of existing network to make that thrive, and then really make sure I spend the time and the energy on understanding what we don't know. So quite a few years ago now, but the old US Secretary of State, Donald Rumsfeld, was really pilloried for having his thing about talking about known unknowns. But there's so much truth in known unknowns. We all kind of know that we've got to be doing things differently to get to people, to influence people's lives that we had influence before, but we don't actually know how to do it. So we're learning how to do that because what we've done before didn't. So I think quite a lot of my week is about understanding more about known unknowns.
Okay.
Out of those few different bits, I suppose it takes a range of different skills to run an organisation, to build partnerships and to learn. Which bit do you feel is most kind of who you are and the bit that you kind of most enjoy, would you say?
That's a good question. I have had to learn, I think, some of the organisational leadership stuff. This is my second chief executive job. The first one was with the British Paralympic Association, which was only an organisation a tenth the size, 30 employees, but had a huge scope and scale in terms of its reach and its influence and its partnerships. That's the bit where I feel the most naturally comfortable. It comes on to what we want to talk about relationships and change management and the fundamental understanding and belief, which is, a little marker. One of the things I'd like people to hear from me today and maybe take away is that sometimes really thinking about how, not what, is a key to success. We're all traditionally brought up, especially through school, to think about what it is that you know, what it is that you think you're doing, what are you, responsible for, what are you trying to deliver. And actually, increasingly, the success of that is driven by how you do it. And I've always felt a little bit more comfortable naturally in the sort of engagement and relationship and stakeholder space. Whereas the organisational leadership stuff, which is in my case, I'm the responsible accountable officer to government for £300 million of public money every year. And the Treasury pay very close attention to that. And if I really read the guidance that they put to chief executives, I wouldn't get out of bed in the morning because it's terrifying. But the reality is you have to learn that skill. You have to learn and understand how to react and respond to that. And of course, as everyone does, those of us in the world of work, you work in organisations with structures and hierarchies and silos and strengths and weaknesses and policies and procedures and, IT that doesn't work and, drains that get blocked and, all that. So there's the very practical sense of leadership as well. But, and then the third bit, I guess, is, I grew up professionally through sort of communications jobs. That was my area sort of before becoming a more broader leader. So that element of the role that is about communicating, about understanding that people sometimes look to organisations and their leaders just to show the way. That for me is the difference between, somebody once said to me that, managers work in the business and leaders work on the business. And I think that's probably how I see my role, is to be thinking about where the business is going. And in our case, it's the business of being active.
So I think what's firstly great to hear is when you sat here with the Chief Executive of Sport England as part of one of the local delivery pilots, where he describes something, you think, oh, thank God that's what we're doing. Because an awful lot of what you just described there of this how and supporting the partners who aren't necessarily. But
I get it in reverse. So I come out to see the work on the ground as opposed to being in my London office, and I have exactly the same relationship with that, which is to say, and the reaction, which is to say, thank God, because I'm getting validated. Because otherwise I'd just think I was saying it for the almost in a vacuum. So you're hearing it from me and thinking that's great, we're doing the right. I'm looking to the work that you're doing and learning from the pilots particularly.
And what that must be saying is the time's right for this. That must be what it's saying is there's enough people now saying actually the time's right now to take our time and get this right. Yes. The time's right to think differently about how we do it and move away from the tradition. The time's right to start challenging people to say no, we can and we should do this differently.
100%.
And I'm going to put my hand up and be the leader of that in my own particular place. So
a couple of things on that very quickly. One is just down the road we've got another LDP in Greater Manchester. And Andy Burnham obviously is a very prominent leader within the pilot, let alone in his role as mayor. And it's not that long ago, a couple of weeks ago, Andy Burnham described what we were collectively seeking to do as being on the right side of history, which is your point. Is that nobody really knows where this is going, but it feels like we're heading in the direction of doing the thing that's needed now. The other thing is, if you look, you don't have to just look in our environment. You just have to look across society generally, and the imbalance and the inequality. And the way of working and the historic sort of imbalances that have been driven not just geographically but socially, and recognise that actually if we just carry on doing the same things, to the old phrase, we'll get the same results. So this is another example, Jamie, of being on the right side of history, because actually if we just go back to that old mechanistic way of delivering, we won't change the dial.
I think what's really interesting for me when we talk about this kind of leadership and culture and those three different elements of your work, actually, thinking about our listeners and within our place in Together an Active Future and some of the people we've met with today, those kind of elements are the same at a council level, they're the same in a leisure trust, they're even the same in almost every home in the country. There's some organisation to do, there's some relationship building to do, there's some leadership and inspiring people to do. And I think on this journey of physical activity, what we're learning is that actually we don't need 1, 2 or 3 place leaders. We need leaders in every home, on every street, in every place, to be saying, come on, let's go for a walk, let's join in, let's see if we can influence the other people on our street and try and kind of grow this culture that you would grow in an organisation like Sport England. I'm going to come on to that now. But we need to kind of start to grow those cultures even just within our homes and on our streets.
Having the right thing to get behind makes that so much easier, doesn't it? So if there's something that everybody can get behind, it can bring the leaders out. As opposed, there's something we can all unite behind here.
Yeah, we're working, coming on Sport England, but we're working really, really hard in the practical business at the moment of putting together a new strategic plan. We're working really, really hard on that sense of what our shared purpose is and should be. Because I think it's been implicit before and we need it to be explicit. Again, you talk about organisational change. One of the reflections for me working in a much bigger organisation is that unless you're explicit about purpose, people interpret it on the front line and you get a slightly different version of what the organisational purpose is. And although in essence that's still fundamentally linked and the same, it should actually be much more holistic than it currently is at times. So I completely agree with you. You need to get behind that sense of shared purpose, and then you can be much more flexible and much more collaborative about how you do it, because it's not a mechanism anymore. It's a vision for why it matters, and that's really I think you make a really good point.
What are some of the practical things, in terms of real kind of tangible pieces of work or changes that you feel that you've been able to start or make at Sport England so far? Well,
I've been there just over a year, and in coming in, I think one of the things that I realised I could help with, and therefore moving on from where we were, because I think Sport England, if anyone who sort of follows Sport England, we've radically changed our strategic direction in the last 5 years on the back of government being a lot more of the view that its investment in sport had to have a social benefit, a social outcome that was broader than simply people playing games, and therefore measuring it against where is the benefit in terms of physical well-being and mental well-being, where is the benefit to people's individual sense of confidence and development, where is the benefit critically to communities and the social cohesion, and ultimately where perhaps is the economic benefit to the nation as a result of that. And if you start there, then you have to reinvent your function and purpose, and did so quite radically about 5 years ago with the last strategy. What I think where I came in after my predecessor, Jenny Price, moved on, was the sense of, well, if that's the direction of travel and it's a very powerful one, how do we have to operate to get that done? Because it's a different way of working to how it was before. So the first, in just over a year, probably the thing I'd point to the most, Ken, would be a real strong focus on our organisational values. So we spent a huge amount of time asking the question externally as well, but particularly internally, what should our values be and how do they drive behaviour? And then how do we, once we've established them, actually make sure that those behaviours matter and are rewarded, and if they're not present, are called out? Before we got onto a new strategy, before we looked at mechanistic solutions, we've come up with a new set of values within Sport England. There are what we call our we are statements. So we are collaborative, we are inclusive, we're ambitious, and we're innovative. And I remembered all four. Good.
People would have been judging.
No. But the reason why, of course,
there's actually 5.
Yeah, exactly. Yes, we are forgetful. The reality is, my colleagues understood, I think, or understand that they're more than just having statements on a wall, which is important because they're very visible. It's about changing behaviour and measuring ways of working through behaviour as much as technical skill or experience.
And I think just one thing I wanted to say on that, and again, I need to get out of the habit of this, knocking the NHS bit that I work in, but ultimately I'm really intrigued by...
Could be risky that long term.
Oh well, maybe Tim's got a job he can offer me when that doesn't work out. But I think that bit of having the values is great, but rewarding that... but also calling those out. And I think, an organisation generally will go, we asked people what they thought, we turned them into values, there we go, so we've done the job. Versus, no. Now, how do you help your workforce and the others who are representing you get to that place? What support might they need? And how do we make sure we've got the right people who are ultimately the faces of Sport England and whatever guys?
Living the values, absolutely. And recognising why they matter as well, which is not about actually being just nice to each other. It's absolutely recognising that if you have a values-based way of working, you are then sending a very powerful signal internally and externally about how you're going to operate. And if you're not then living up to those, it really fails. It falls over. And I think actually I've encountered a set of colleagues who are thirsty for this. Any organisation's culture relies, I think, on two things: the values and behaviours that it has, and its ways of working. So still within Sport England, we've still got to think about ways of working. So if you apply for a grant from Sport England, how easy is it? How simple or burdensome are our sort of administrative processes internally? How clear is it where people feel they've got delegated authority that they can genuinely take it? All the sort of practical sense of ways of working. If you align that with behaviours, you get a very strong sense of what your organisational culture is. And then if you present that externally, you set the tone and the basis immediately for how you wish to collaborate. And a brilliant thing that I can't claim credit for, because it was the guy who runs British Swimming, actually, Jack Butner. Jack Butner said to me, good collaboration is a contact sport. And he's absolutely right. And we could find that within the pilots perhaps as well. That, you're not in it to just say, yes, we agree. You're in it to find that mutual shared purpose and then work really hard in a collaborative way to achieve better outcomes than you're able to do by yourself. And that's why the change behaviour and the leadership change that I'm trying to bring to Sport England has a very clear purpose, that if we're going to genuinely raise the activity levels of the nation and make sport at the heart of people's lives, then we can't do it alone. We can't possibly transact. We have 300 people and we have £300 million. We have a lot more resource than many organisations, but that's a drop in the ocean. I think our total annual budget is equivalent to something like 18 hours of the NHS budget, for example. So we are the only way we can even potentially have the sort of hope of engaging at a population-wide basis in terms of raising activity levels is to collaborate and to find ways to do that across health, across education, increasingly, really interestingly, because it's being accelerated by the climate change agenda, the sort of built environment and transport. Whereas before that was a bit of a sort of niche sort of intervention, trying to get people to walk and cycle more. With climate change agenda coming so much to the fore, it's becoming a lot more part of the fabric of conversation.
Sometimes some timings can just help, can't they?
Yeah.
Things weren't ready 2 or 3 years ago, but other things change in life that means they might do. So I'm mindful of the third success factor of trains, Tim. I'm keeping an eye on time. Okay. So I think we're going to move into the next section, Ken, and then we'll come back to the next topic. Is that all right?
Yeah.
With our pen and quickfire questions.
We will.
Okay.
Okay, here we go.
So the way that this works, we're going to have a little bit of a ticking timer to increase the pressure.
Yeah.
We're going to ask you 9 questions that you're not expecting, and you just say the first thing that comes into your head, and hopefully listeners will learn a bit more about you.
Yeah.
The only other rule is that if at any point you say something that we enjoyed or want to challenge more, we get to stop the clock and quiz you on it a bit further. Happy with that?
I am.
You're going to read it?
Yes.
Right. Okay, here we go.
Okay, what is your nickname?
I haven't had one for years, actually, that I know about, but it was Holly at school.
Okay, like that. What's your favourite movie ever?
Apocalypse Now.
Oof.
What one thing that annoys you?
Fulham throwing away an early lead.
And one thing that excites you?
Fulham holding on to an early lead.
How long does it take you to get ready in the morning?
Now I've got a beard, which is a new thing for 2020. Much less time, actually. Not shaving in the morning.
Okay. New thing for 2020 because
I had 2 weeks genuinely off between Christmas and New Year for the first time in a long time, and I didn't shave. And
so you felt like literally, I'm going to sit on the couch and I'm going to do nothing.
Yeah, pretty
much.
I've had an incredibly frank year, my first year at Sport England, and at the end of 2 weeks I thought, okay, carry it on.
Okay, it's looking well on you.
Yeah.
Describe yourself in 3 words.
Committed, interested, and ambitious.
Okay. Qualifications, experience or personality?
The best qualification to be Chief Executive of Sport England, I've got a master's degree in drama.
Okay. I love that. Master's degree in drama.
Yeah.
If there's a spider in your house, do you kill it or set it free?
Oh, I set it free, 100%.
And if you had one superpower, what would it be?
The ability to go back in time and do something differently.
Ooh.
Oh! I felt the need to pause that. Then is there something in your mind particularly?
Yeah, not in a big profound way.
Oh, okay.
But just in that sense, apart from maybe as a parent, when I might just do the whole thing differently. Occasionally, you just think, I'm better at that now. Imagine if I knew this now, then.
Yeah.
But of course you didn't. That's all. It's not sincere as in, oh, I'd do that differently. But I know that there are things now that I know that if I'd known that then type thing. It's the sort of, can you tell your younger self superpower? If the things you
It's
could
the
tell
frustration of life.
Yes.
As things encounter, you're not quite ready for them.
Yes.
But 10 years later, you'll know how to perfectly nail it.
Correct. So you share that. That's what I meant. Not the power to do things with him, but just to tell my younger self.
Well, that's what.
That was it.
Oh, was it?
There is one more. This is the big one. Jamie or Ken?
Alison.
Oh,
Whoa, well done.
Well played.
Beautifully skirted, and actually the right answer.
Yeah,
because we're horrid.
I've got, just before we move on, one very quick question. What is the thing that you took from your masters in drama that has, if there's one thing that I wasn't expecting you to say.
No, and very few people are, and it was the bit of my life when I was younger that was very important to me. And I did remember having somebody, I met just after I graduated, saying it would be like having a criminal record when it came to getting a job. But the reality is I've taken a huge amount, not just from the master, but my whole experience of being in, loving the sort of theatre and performance and communication in that context. Has equipped me with that fundamental sort of arrogance that I can cope with an audience, which is in this job really, really important.
It's massive, though, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's that confidence of being able to stand in front of people and inspire or enthuse or bring on board with something huge.
And if it is inspiring or enthusing, it's because I genuinely enjoy it. So I'm never, the idea of saying, I've got to go and speak to so-and-so, or I've got to go and do this or that, or do this podcast, is actually something I enjoy. And that came from that fundamental understanding of performance. I've also learned another thing that's genuinely contextual to sort of the business world and leadership and roles now, which is that my own developed sense, this is my own one theory of flexible authenticity, because those two words sound like they're contradictory, but they're not. So you've got your very strong sense of your authentic self, your values, how you see the world, what matters to you, what you think is important. But you can't be completely, isolated from the world around you when you deliver that. So you have to flex it. You have to understand that some audiences will need a bit of you, and I don't mean audiences in a literal sense, but or some environment. Others will need another one. And it was particularly clear. My last job was very much more international. I was very conscious about how I would behave differently for different cultures and different people from other nationalities. And I didn't feel inauthentic at all, because what I was trying to be was still the same. Yeah. So that sense, again, in the theatre and in performing, of that sort of sense of flexible authenticity is, I think, a skill. And I think you can learn it. And I think it's one that I feel is really significant to actually being able to be a sort of 21st century leader, where knowledge is either very available through Google or very employable through somebody who knows it better than you do. The ability to translate that into a sort of authentic message is less taught. Wow. There you go. That's what a master's degree in drama's told me. Apart from that,
I need to go and get one.
Yeah.
Well, my little girl's currently going to young kind of drama classes.
Okay.
And there's stick with it, because I'm doing it because I thought. I mean, she's a relatively confident girl anyway.
Yeah.
But it's just about building up that skill of not being afraid of standing in front of people. It's not really that scary once you've done it a few times. It takes a lot of us our work experience to teach us that.
Yes.
But if you can do it even sooner, then you're almost better placed for the kind of future of career and life.
It also teaches you to listen, which might be ironic, given I've just interrupted you. But, it does teach you to listen, because if you're honest, if it happens to be performance that you're into, if you're on a stage and you're trying to be sort of rather believable in your performance, you've got to be listening to what's going on around you to know when your moment comes, and that's quite a skill.
And you were listening to mine and you realised it was nonsense, so you
interrupted.
So that's absolutely fine. Most people are less polite about it. Okay, wicked. So I think we're going to move into the next kind of theme, which I think, coming back to the success factor of you saying it would be good to bring out some of the things from today, I think now's probably a good chance to do that. So what we wanted to talk about is, so whether it be Sport England, local delivery pilots, or the places we live and work, there are leaders. There are leaders there, and we need leaders and that kind of thing. So what I want to talk about is, what do we think are some of the practical things, the skills, the characteristics that leaders need to be able to influence change, whether it be in an organisation or the way a thing or a process happens in work? and just get into that kind of discussion a little bit.
Yeah, and I think the first thing that springs to mind for me is probably link a few ideas that we've already touched on. This idea of authenticity and leadership. I think there's something really important for me around storytelling and being able to tie cultural values and principles and that kind of realness together in real stories and sharing a bit of ourselves with the people that we're working with to create that sense of realness. Like, I'm a regular, real kind of person who is passionate about this because I've got a story to tell and a deeper kind of connection with this work. And so I think, just throwing out that first one, I think the ability that can be a learned thing, again, the sort of amateur dramatics or that kind of theatre performance type space, the ability to tell stories is something that I think is going to be really important for place leaders as we move forward.
Yes, because it is completely, again, the new way of understanding what matters, which is that very often it's about having the level of trust. One of my colleagues who's been with us today, Chris, talks often about now progress moves at the speed of trust, and you gain trust through a bit of humbleness and willingness to expose yourself to things that you don't know and wanting to learn from others. And in the case of storytelling, you absolutely gain trust from contextualising what you do. And it is a harder job, and I saw it today, and it's been a real positive for me today not to only to have been out and visiting, local environment, local projects and things that are going on the ground, but actually to have a slight step back and to be in the room with so many people who are involved in the Together an Active Future pilot. Because what I could see around the room was the manifestation of the behaviours that are needed. This is how, not what again, as much as the excellent, technical skills or, policy-driven skills that were in the room. And then there was a real willingness to share and a real willingness to tell stories and a real willingness to collaborate based on that sense of shared purpose, which came through very clearly. We also spent a bit of time today, recognising how difficult it can be, and therefore a lot of time and energy needs to be spent on just allowing everyone to get over the problems and not wait for them, and not presume that you've got to go off on a massive 100 mile an hour straight line, but actually recognise there might be times when you just need to pause and recognise collectively that you've got to understand what you're all hearing before you can move on. And we talked about evaluation, and again I think the pilots, and this one particularly, where you've got quite a complexity around the 6 local authorities. You've got the complexity of the very different areas that you're dealing with. You've got the complexity of there's quite cultural cultural complexity as well in the area. There's all kinds of reasons why straightforward analysis of problem and delivery is not an obvious route to go down. So quite a lot about that sense of what are you learning and then what are you evaluating being really difficult, but it's really important.
I think. And that's why we let Ken Barnsley do the evaluation stuff.
Yes.
He's a very thoughtful guy.
Yeah, he is. He's good. So I think some of the stuff that kind of feels really kind of personal to me is... so one of the things we've talked about is it's surprising often that people forget that they're a person in the same way that a person across the room from them, the person they're talking to. It's easy to forget that when you're in an organisation or when you're there as a role, that actually they're a human being, you're a human being. There's no difference between you. The particular environment you're in at the moment is the thing that's different.
Yeah.
But actually, you're a human being. So have a think about the reality of how you'd feel in a certain situation, the reality of your life and how that's impacted. So that you're instantly kind of breaking down that separation between the things. And we've done an awful lot of work around the kind of just creating that environment. So that the space that you're in, the person feels comfortable in sharing and being part of something with you. You're creating something that they feel, I could be part of this. Because this sounds like the kind of thing that I would be part of. This person talks in the right way, in the language that I use. Hopefully, if it's in the same accent, all the more better. And just that sense of, it feels like our role as leaders to create the environment for the people who know best to be able to make the change that gives them a positive change in their lives.
I'll put that point exactly, Jamie, into a sort of slightly more theoretical context. So we have been conditioned generationally to believe that the key to leadership is taking space, where you own it and you deliver something, because people's expectations are that if you're a leader, you'll know and you'll have the solutions, and you present them, and then everyone goes away with them, and that's how it works. Actually, the real job of leadership at the moment is to do what I think is called hold space, which is to be confident enough to provide the environment for exactly that conversation to happen, for people to feel that it's there for them, not for you, because you get the benefit that you're looking for.
Absolutely.
Unquestionably. So a big challenge for all of us is those of us that have the positions of leadership is to hold the space for the change, not create and take the space and believe that that's our job.
Yeah,
and it's a really, again, it goes back to the cultural points, what you wanted to talk about. But you can only do that if you understand that your behaviour matters as much as what you know.
Yeah. No, I completely agree.
And I'll tell you something else as well, although, because I am, obviously nice southern posh boy. I know this.
It's not your fault.
But also, I'm going to.
We're going to mention it.
I'm going to throw in my credibility that Alison already knows, which was, my mother was born and brought up in Accrington, so this is a part of the world that I do know. But I do. There's a phrase that resonates with me for Sport England nationally, not so much in this environment, but it really makes me understand how difficult change is. Is that so? When you're accustomed to privilege, equality feels like oppression, and I think. I've thought about that phrase a great deal, and I don't know how it relates to here. I don't think it does relate necessarily to TaAF, but it's that sense of how when you challenge a status quo, it feels oppressive to those who've been used to the previous thing being commonplace, as though that was a level of equality. And actually, because you've been used to privilege, it's really hard to get people to change their views and their perspective, and you can't do that without taking them on the journey. So that's why. It's really important for me that when we are in rooms with organisations who felt that it hasn't been set up for them, or that they felt excluded from that which has gone before, it's a very big part of Sport England's idea of what the future looks like, which is that we understand that to make it possible for everyone to feel that activity can be for them, it has to be on terms that make sense for them. And I'm not sure we've always been, as an organisation and as a sector, as aware of that as we should be.
So, just getting into the kind of other skills and characteristics that we think we might need. So, kind of that recognising that maybe your role is a role to create the environment for others and kind of hold that space as you described. Do you feel there's a certain need for stubbornness in staying true to the kind of purpose and belief that you've set out? Because again, it's an easy thing to pick a thing that you think's the right thing, and then slowly over time be moved away from it because it feels like an easier path sometimes to take. So, what's your view on kind of the need to be positively stubborn? Which is a new phrase I think coined.
Which is not a bad one, apart from the fact that it depends on the level of your stubbornness. So, again, going back to where we are now as an organisation and thinking about our strategy. Is that if we are going to be sure about our purpose, we then need to be stubborn about that purpose. But you cannot be stubborn about the details because that preordains an outcome. And so one of the, we're talking about behaviours here of leaders. One of the things that leaders have got to be able to differentiate between is a sort of relentless stubbornness around purpose. But an absolute flexibility around the best route to get there. Yeah. And that's quite difficult when you're trying to manage either an organisation or a programme, because normally you've got to report it and you've got to account for it and you've got to show, you're working. But I would say in response to your question, yes, stubbornness, but only about purpose, not about the ways you're going to do it, because very often you'll find that the route that you've taken is not the best. And if you're really open to it, you can find a better route through a different approach.
I think for me, perhaps stubbornness, but perhaps more integrity and courage, in the sense that this is what we believe, and even in the face of some challenge against those principles and values that we share, that challenge of it doesn't need to change, we can stay the same is really good. It's that sense of being true to your values and having integrity on that, and I think something that Jamie is really, really good at, and you mentioned earlier, Tim, is this sense of being prepared to have the courage to call something out and say, hang on, that is not in line with our values, that this isn't perhaps a way that we want to behave, and that takes courage and boldness and maybe stubbornness as well, a collection of all those words, none of which are quite right by themselves.
Yeah. Just because I think a lot of the time in language there's sometimes a negative connotation, even though the word itself by definition is a negative word.
Yes.
Yeah.
You know, and thank you, Ken. I think that's the first compliment I've ever had, at least live on a podcast.
It's likely to be the last one.
Yes,
it's on tape.
Yeah, perfect. Alison will be asked to edit that out later. But I think, and there's a flip side of that, such as, so I am willing to just challenge a behaviour because I expect others to do that to me, and I think there's also that bit of, but be absolutely willing to take the same kind of views and opinions and feedback on your own behaviours. Because actually that's what it should be about. Mm-hmm. We should be in a space where we feel safe enough with each other that you can point something out to me, I can go, do you know what, that's a fair point, and I probably didn't approach that right. Thank you very much for sharing it, as opposed to letting that kind of thing.
And that courage is true that's the definition of true collaboration, where you are in an environment where you feel you can call out things that you don't agree with or behaviours that you don't agree with, because actually it's for that common purpose, that shared purpose. It doesn't happen when you think you're just, trying to be nice to each other. And
I think it's, in my working life, which has been varied, it's certainly in my public sector working life, is people aren't used to that, and it is uncomfortable. And I think it's one of the biggest learnings that needs to start to happen, is that people do feel uncomfortable about speaking out in a room where they feel like it might not be received as positively as they'd hope.
I think some of the best moments for Together Active Future and Local Delivery Pilot of when, we went through a phase probably the first 3 or 4 months where that was a real essence of who we were in challenging each other and ourselves to say, well, hang on, that's how I used to think, or I think that's how people think I'm supposed to think, but how do I actually feel about this, and what do I actually believe in, and is the status quo something that I'm willing to accept? And that whole sense of discovering yourself, I think, is a really important part of this journey to be a place-based leader, to discover what's really important to you. And this is a second compliment for Jamie.
Oh, whoa.
It definitely will be the last.
Wow.
But something that I sense from both of you, just in this last half an hour together, but across the course of the day and the work we've done together, is there's a real sense of energy for the values and the passion, and a passion for the work that's needed or the outcomes we're hoping for. And that level of energy is consistent, and it brings a real sense of zest and enthusiasm, and it's kind of infectious as well. And that we've got a lot of talk of infectious stuff at the moment.
Yes.
But energy is super important in this work, to kind of bring energy even against some of the challenges we've talked about before.
Energy pandemic, is that what you're saying?
Yeah, that's what we need. Yeah.
So I'm going to ask you one question, Tim, to kind of wrap this up a little bit and look for a quick fire answer, whatever answer you would like to give.
Yeah.
But so, what are your hopes from the local delivery pilots and the kind of leaders within?
Yeah, I think I can answer that, because I'm thinking about it a lot in the context of our strategic direction now. I genuinely believe, not just hope, I believe that the local delivery pilots have changed something. I think that for Sport England first, and then I hope for the wider sort of environment and the ecosystem of which we're all part, is that when we started out with the local delivery pilots, I still think they were fundamentally a transactional way of working. There was a belief, I think, in my colleagues then at the time, the pilots would unearth some sort of silver bullet program, and it could be in Blackburn with Darwin, or it could be in Basildon, or it could be in Essex, in Exeter. And that we would then be able to take that and scale it across the whole country, and suddenly everyone would be active, and it would be great. I think within the context of the 12 pilots, which are all very, very different, it's actually the thing that is emerging from them consistently. It's the way of working across the pilots that is the learning. And I think that's going to influence... I feel like we've turned the telescope around. So we have traditionally, as an organisation, looked down on a problem with a view that we've got to impose something on that problem in order to fix it. And in turning the telescope around with the pilots, we've started to look at what's being shown to us, and actually how we need to respond to that accordingly. So my hope for the pilots, but I think it's beyond hope, I think it's a belief, is that as we look strategically to how we should work differently, and create the sort of behaviour change in across all of England that we're desperate to achieve, that the way of working that the pilot have delivered, as opposed to a program that an individual pilot has created. And there are lots of great programs, but they're asset based. They're about the community that they're in. The real outcome will be the way of working.
So just to wrap up a few of I've just been jotting down a few of these perhaps leadership qualities or behaviours that we've chatted about. So we've talked about.
I'm quite pleased it's a long list.
Yeah, it's a long list. I think we've done quite well, but some of them I've split out into 2 or 3 that are probably only really one. So we talked a bit about storytelling. We talked a bit about taking space to think and to assess problems from a different angle. We talked about building trust and being authentic. Having a sense and a desire to learn all the time about and reflect human connections and the look and the sound of the feel of the way we interact with our communities. We touched on quite heavily, not taking the space but holding the space for others to have input and a view. That balance of privilege and equality and looking at things in a different way and not just assuming that how you want it to be is the right way for it to be. Courage and that balance between courage and collaboration. Having really high energy, and I think probably to summarise all that, thinking really about how you do things and not necessarily what it is you're going to do, but how you're going to move things forward and how you're going to interact with others. So I think that's a pretty strong list for local leaders in the system.
If I may say, it's a very good summary. Thank you, Ken. I like
compliments
that.
Back to you.
Yeah, absolutely.
I haven't done anything else, so the list was solid.
So I think just a really, really quick one. We constantly want to try and give Sporting credit for creating the vehicle that's allowing us to do this firstly, because it's fundamentally changing the way we work as people and organisations eventually, and therefore fundamentally changing who we are as human beings and how we do stuff. It's a really big deal to us, this. It really is something we're passionate and excited about, and that's because Sporting are allowing it to happen in that way. So thank you guys and all of your team and everybody else who's kind of backed this stuff, because it's great. So we're going to wrap it up. So success factors. So we don't know about the train. Message us later to let us know if you got there. It looks okay.
Yeah,
I think we'll be okay. So one thing we wanted to do was share a bit of our learning and insight that you gained from today, and I think we absolutely did that. And what was the other thing? So I've dropped my pad on the floor and I can't remember what it was.
Neither can I.
It was understand the sort of qualities of leadership and what we thought about leadership.
I'll tell you what, Tim's coming back for podcast 2.
You're a much better podcaster than we are. Maybe and it's the Masters in Drama that's done it.
Yeah, no, there you go.
Nailed it.
So brilliant. So thank you as always for listening to our podcast. If you enjoyed it, you can follow us on Twitter at TaAF Talks. Please tweet away and have your say. And look out for our next one. Subscribe on the various platforms you can to listen out for future podcasts. So just wrap up now. As we always like to do, we will hand over to the guest for the final thoughts. So over to you, Tim.
Well, thank you, Jamie. Thank you, Ken. Thank you for having me today. My final thought is not an original one. I'm going to quote Abraham Lincoln for you. And I'm actually going to do 2 different things that he said that I think wrap up everything. Number 1 is he said, if I've got 6 hours to chop down a tree, I'm going to spend the first 4 sharpening the axe. I'd just like to remind everyone that it's really good sometimes just to sharpen your axe. Don't always just rush in. Don't always think you've got to get something done straight away. And sometimes it can be personal too. It's sometimes good to just take a bit of a step away and just do a bit of own personal axe sharpening, if that works. And then my very, very favourite quote, which probably didn't say, it's probably the internet, but which matters to me more than anything else, and the only message I would ultimately give anyone is, he said, whatever you are, be a good one. And I think that is a good message to leave it with.